Bruce Feldman, senior writer, theathletic.com, with a story that came out. College coaches described the favorite play call of their careers. I'm pretty sure it's going to work. And he looked at a lot of – first thing I thought about were 3 or 4 games that are on this list based on those who he spoke with. He's on with Craig and Paul. David Smoke, 365 Sports. Bruce, I said this earlier, and I said it to you. You come up with some, especially during the off times, some really unique and great ideas on articles that make a lot of sense once you dig into them, including, of course, the freaks and all that. When did this idea come in your mind? And how was like a couple of months, a couple of weeks, or what?
I have to thank you for the kind words first. I got to be honest. In this one, I have to tip my hat to one of my editors, Mitch Light, who had been thinking about this idea for a long time, and then he had talked to me about a little of it. And then we kind of put our heads together on who would be good to speak to, because then it felt like it was, more of an offensive coach's bent as much as anything. And so this story, it's almost a year in the making. I remember I started talking to guys back last summer. There was a lot more I talked to that didn't, for one reason or another, didn't make the final cut because of story length. But it was a fun story to work on. My favorite one was actually a play that I got from Jim Donnan, a Hall of Fame coach who had been at Georgia and Marshall, had told me about when he was an OC back at Oklahoma in the Keith Jackson, the football player days, and the fact that we were able to find video of it. It was such a fun play, and like so many of these, some of the plays were offbeat, some of the plays were trick plays in big games, but it was a fun project to work on.
We had Hal Mumme, by the way, Bruce, on our show yesterday in discussion about the criteria for the National Football Foundation coaches and Hall of Fame inductees or nominees with the Mike Leach connection. And I was like, man, he's on this list. Of course, he was well known for being an amazing play caller, too.
He was. I mean, really innovative. He and Mike were the brains behind the air raid and that offense, which, spread in some form or fashion all over, especially the state of Texas and high school football and everything else. It was fun to talk to Hal, because Hal had a play that, was basically one of them where it came back to our receiver was the one who really pushed for it. He was confident, let's give it a try. And it obviously worked out great. It was one of the more simple plays in here, but it was obviously big circumstance that had then beaten Alabama, Kentucky, and forever. So it was fun to. That was the other thing that was really cool about this story, was there's so many different reasons why somebody could feel like it was a favorite play. Maybe it was super creative. Maybe it was in a spot that they had been setting it up for a long time, or other times it was like this, where it was just the player had so much conviction that they're like, yeah, why not? Let's just do that.
So there were a couple guys way back from the archives that you talked to. My favorite one being Norm Chow, who, because he was, an assistant coach for all that time, maybe doesn't get as much shine as he maybe deserves. He was a quarterback guru, and when you talked to him, was it kind of wild that he went to NC State in that time, or were you shocked where he came up with his favorite play?
Well, what was interesting was we talked about it, and a lot of these guys, it's almost easier to text people and say, hey, this is the story, because then it gives them a time to think about it. Whereas like Troy Calhoun, the Air Force coach, he kind of workshopped about 6 different plays over the course of a conversation. Dave Clawson, who didn't end up making the final version of the story at Wake Forest, also had a couple of those. With Norm, he remembered this play 2 different ways, because they ran it, back when in the Phillip Rivers days when he was at NC State, but they also ran it when he was the offensive coordinator at USC with Leinart and Mike Williams, the receiver. And so it was just interesting that he, as he remembered it, he was thinking back. It was one of these guys, I know Leinert's left-handed and how they were going to do this, but there were just certain variations. And I think because in that case, it's over 25 years ago, where he remembers it, but then some of the details, he was like, I don't even remember the receiver, who was involved in it. I don't remember his name. And then when I told him, he was like, oh, yeah, that's right. It's just because it's been so long for some of these guys.
Bruce, how often is it maybe the play that people aren't thinking of that is actually more special for the coach? I mean, Chris Peterson from that Oklahoma win, but not the play that everybody, as you point out in your article, that people would think of. And some of these are the plays that people would think of, but oftentimes it's a different vantage point for a coach, isn't it?
Protect your online privacy with NordVPN. Browse securely, access content from anywhere, and keep your data safe with military-grade encryption. Whether at home or on the go, NordVPN ensures your digital freedom. Stay secure. Download NordVPN today at nordvpn.com. That's NORDVPN.com.
Yeah, and that was the example. Like now I work with Coach Pete at Fox, and so we talk quite a bit. And I had talked to him. I was like, we ran this Statue of Liberty play in, with the team of 9-year-olds I was coaching at the time. And so we showed, a couple of the kids the play. And then he was like, on that play, look how close, his quarterback, Jared Zabransky's feet are to Ian Johnson, where it's like that thing almost falls apart immediately because you don't realize how close they are to tripping over each other. And so I've had that play in my mind so much, but he was like, no, it's actually the play a couple plays before that, which it happens to tie the game up late in the game before it goes into overtime. And it was a wild, it's the hook and ladder play. They pull it off, on 4th and 18 with 18 seconds left. And so I said to him, and he's a little older than me, but, so, the first time I ever saw that play, I was a little kid. We were on vacation in Florida, and I remember the Dolphins hit that. I remember the player who did it was Tony Nathan, who was a all-purpose running back from Alabama. Yeah, I feel like there's two of us who are going to remember this. It was so long ago, and they did it against the Chargers when it was Dan Fouts and Kellen Winslow. It was a great game, but I sent him it, and he goes, man. He goes, I was surprised he didn't remember that initially, but it was like when they hit it, it was perfect. It was like I had never seen it. I'm not sure. How many times people had seen that play in like major football setting where it was like run so perfectly in such a big situation. It was right before half. Tony Nathan just, catches the flip on the dead run up the sideline. And it wasn't like he was the fastest man on the field, but nobody was catching him. And it was just a perfect play. And so when Coach Pete did it, he was like, yeah, we didn't have a lot of other options at that point. So it was like, we got to do it.
Yeah, you mentioned Don, and I'm a lifelong Nebraska fan. And yes, the last 2 decades have been a little bit disturbing. But on that play to Keith Jackson, I'm old enough to remember that play. It's like a reverse to Keith Jackson, and it was kind of crowded, wasn't it, Bruce? Where he got the ball, it had to be like flawless timing because they weren't able to get him the football. Nebraska had kind of been able to keep him out of the game a little bit. I remember that when I saw that article, I was like, oh my God, that was a brilliant call.
Yeah, it was crazy. It was from their own 12, so number 88 goes 88 yards, and he was a great player. And Donna had told me they put it in for Colorado the week before, and then they ended up saving it for Nebraska. When you watch that play, one of the things, Jim had told me was like, Keith had to be a great actor because it's like, he's coming, like he's like basically fake blocking, and then he comes around. And I was like, of all the plays in this story, and we have video for most of them, this was my favorite play because I was like, oh my God, this, like you could see, especially, he was arguably the most talented athlete on the offense. And when it hits, it is, I'd be curious how many times people have tried some version of this, like Georgia had Brock Bowers. Different, like I'm not saying they never thought of it, but just like it works because it was an element of Oklahoma's offense. So they had this, what they called it was 15Y reverse right. And he said, we had 14 and 15 were basically fullback inside veer. One was to the left, one was to the right. And this was the wrinkle off it. And I think a lot of times that's what makes the play so special when teams think it's going to be this because they're used to seeing it. And then the one time, it's got to hit. And this one absolutely did.
You mentioned Rich Rodriguez. Of course, he's now back at West Virginia. When he was with Tulane, your thoughts about him being back at West Virginia for a second tour?
I think it's great for West Virginia. I mean, he had it rolling when he left, to go to Michigan. Obviously, didn't work out there. But I think he's a West Virginia guy. He's a really good coach. I think people forgot how much success he had at Arizona when nobody was, thinking much of them at that time. I think it's a really good move for the Big 12. I think it's a really good move for West Virginia. He did a really good job at Jacksonville State before he got there. I think he will get some players there. I mean, he knows that state better than anybody. I'm curious to see how it goes. Like Neil Brown's a good coach, and I think he did some good things there. And obviously Dana Holgerson was there, and I think he fit in well there. But to me, you look at the Rich Rod had a bunch of top 10 teams. They're a bit dangerous because now you're in the Big 12 without Texas, without Oklahoma. That conference, as you guys know, is really up for grabs. So I'm not saying that they'll do what ASU did last year and come from seemingly nowhere and win it all, but it wouldn't shock me. I mean, he's a really good coach, and they have some good players. And again, I don't think the talent gap is significant anywhere in that league.
How long could this article have been had you left everything in there? I'm curious because you talked to a lot of coaches.
Question. Yeah. That is a great question. I had a great conversation with Dana Holgerson for a terrific story. And as soon as I called my editor about this, I was like, it's almost like a separate story because the reasons for why he liked a certain play were there was a lot to it, and there was just a lot of stuff in it. And there was it was probably like 6 other coaches who didn't end up making the final version for one reason or another. And, it just it's like most writers, you think there's no such thing as too long of a story.
Yeah.
You kind of realize when you read somebody else, you're like, oh, that could have been a lot shorter. As much as you hate, it pains you to say it. And I'm definitely guilty of that.
Someone who's not thought of, Bruce Feldman, theathletic.com, and the story about the play callers and their favorite or memorable play was he's not known for his offense. It's Kirk Ferentz at Iowa. However, you brought up a bowl game against LSU back when Saban was there. And I kind of like, Kirk Ferentz is on a play calling type of a story. And a lot of times he gets a bad rap. They win a lot. But your thoughts about that one, about the Capital One Bowl against LSU?
Yeah, I mean, I think some of it was cool with Ferentz when he told me the story. There was some fun history behind it because the player who caught it, Warren Holloway, he was like, that was his first touchdown catch. He was like, really good kid, couldn't get lined up for like 4 years, and then he finally figured it out. He was like, every Iowa fan is going to remember this play. And it was actually Saban's last game as the head coach at LSU. So it was like, there's some cool elements to it. Look, Brett Bielema gave me a good story. Brett Bielema was another one who's like, no one's comparing him to, he's a defensive lineman. So, but that's the fun part of it, especially when guys are head coaches, because, they're the ones who will be like, yeah, we're going to run this, or, take the suggestion and go with it. And I would say probably, a third of the guys I ended up running with stuff here were guys that I don't think people think of them as creative offensive minds, but they are, they were the head coach, and it kind of worked. Look, I'm a guy you guys know well.
Yep.
Matt Rule is in this story, and I think he's a really good coach, and he did awesome job at Temple, and then obviously in Waco. But there's another one where it was just like, oh, this is. There's just a personal connection to the story.
Yeah, the one of them was the Oklahoma State game when Denzel Mims caught the pass with under, a couple of 3 seconds left from Charlie Brewer, and it kind of goes over the history there. Bruce, if you don't mind, one more question or two about what you've seen this week with the spring meetings that normally don't get much attention. We know the SEC gets a lot of writers and massive media. Then Brett Yormark and the Big 12 had theirs. The Big 10 had theirs last week, and I don't think anyone even knew the tree fell in the forest. Some of this turf war that we're seeing as these various conferences try to position themselves in the college football playoff format.
The part that I'm not a huge fan of is that you build in, like what the SEC and, the Big 10 want to do is build in like these extra automatic spots. Like the regular season has already been devalued some. We just look. I mean, I was in Columbus Thanksgiving weekend. Ohio State loses the second game to its arch rival. It's not a great season for Michigan. It wasn't like it was anywhere near a top 10 team. And because there's I'm not saying they didn't belong in the playoff because it was a 12-team playoff, but they got in. They ended up winning. They were, to me, the best team. The one thing I had always loved about college football is it felt like when a really good team lost, if they got upset, it was like, man, that might have ruined their chances to win the national title. Maybe it felt like that way 30 years ago. I don't know if it felt that way in the last 10, but there was something to be said of how momentous a game was. Like Urban Meyer had some really bad upset losses with really talented teams. He had one to Iowa, and another one to Purdue, and those games, to me, that's part of the fabric of college football. But now, you may have a 4-loss team in there. Obviously, you only had one 3-loss team in there last year, and that was the ACC champ Clemson. But if it was a 16-team playoff, you probably would have had 3 in the SEC from the SEC. Alabama, which had a terrible loss to a really mediocre Oklahoma team on the road, had a bad loss against a mediocre Vanderbilt team. Then you got Ole Miss, which had a good win against Georgia and a good win earlier in the season against the South Carolina team that was still finding itself. But then they lose to the worst team in the SEC, Kentucky. They lost to them in Oxford. And then all they had to do was, after they beat Georgia, was beat Florida, who was like an unranked team, and they lost to Florida. So they would go, look, I mean, I wasn't like railing against the expansion to go from 4 teams. And I don't want to be a hypocrite and, act, but like, this is what we're getting. You're going to get more teams. I just don't think they need to be automatically in. They'll probably go in anyway, but you really need to do it that way. So, but that's when you're at the top of the food chain and you're flexing your muscle, and you're also, in the case of some of these, ideas, I think that they're trying to make some more revenue streams in terms of getting more games for playing games. And that feels kind of, I don't know. I'm not a huge fan of that either.
Yeah. If in fact there was any kind of a super league that was, let's just say the SEC and the Big Ten, which would be what, 18, 30, how many teams? Would you ever consider, if they just broke away as those 2 conferences, which I don't think they can, no matter what they say, a national champion?
It wouldn't shock me down the road at some point if it got to that. I mean, I go back, like I was at the Rose Bowl last year, right? And like before that game, I remember getting a text from my brother in the state of Florida, and he was like, "Are you watching this?" And it was basically the Arizona State Texas game got pretty wild. And I was like, I saw a bunch of it, but I didn't see it when it got really crazy. And the point of it is, that was, as you guys know, that was the team picked to be in the bottom of the Big 12.
Yep.
They almost beat Texas, who was, to me, the best SEC team last year. You can say it was a fluke or whatever, but it didn't look like a fluke when they were playing each other. I mean, Texas needed a big, desperation play to win that game. So, having said all that, I think those are the things that make college football great, that it almost happened. So I wouldn't want to see that go away. The Big 12 is to me the quirkiest league because it's the most up for grabs, right? There's no Clemson in it. Florida State obviously fell apart last year after almost making the playoff, but Miami has big payroll. Obviously Texas Tech now has, big payroll and, what's going on there. But I just feel like you look at TCU a couple of years ago, was in the national title game. You saw what happened with ASU. I just think like you don't want to lose that element of just the unpredictable nature that I think has college football. And I hope that the powers that be can remember that.
Bruce, do you think Brett Yormark going with 5 + 11 as opposed to 2 guaranteed spots is the right call?
Well, for him, I think it probably is the most sensible one. I just think, you're kind of, I don't want to say spitting in the wind, but like when the other side of it is leaning into it that much, it's an uphill climb. But I think Yormark's been obviously great for the Big 12, and it just like he's pushed a lot of the right buttons. He's pretty much since he's been there. And, in this case, I don't know how much leverage they have with it, though. That's the part that I'm interested to see.
I do think it was the better for, regardless of how much leverage he had or didn't have, I think rather than just taking the 2 gimmies and saying, hey, we'll go win it on the field is actually kind of encouraging and actually kind of refreshing, right? Than saying, let's just automatically dictate it before we've even played a game. That part of it I do enjoy, the 5-11.
No, I think part of his leadership is he's pretty fearless. And, good on him. I think that's like, it's not like he doesn't have resources. It's just, the Big Ten wants to do what the Big Ten wants to do and how they're posturing. And look, whatever, it's like 16 of the last 20 national title teams have come from those 2 leagues, and the last 2 have actually come from the Big Ten. Greg Sankey gets irked when anybody talks about, are you doing it for the good of the game or the good of your conference? But at the end of the day, I'm not, once money's driving all the decisions, I think that other stuff gets pushed aside, and it's you just kind of like, all right, hopefully the game still resembles what the game looked like a few years ago.
Well, articles like the one you wrote today helps everyone keep that in perspective. Bruce, thank you, buddy. I know you're busy. Thanks for your time. Wonderful article.
Thank you, guys. Always a pleasure talking football with you.
Bruce Feldman, the Athletic college football writer.